Hello, I am Joanne Powell-Coffman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an associate dean and a former department chair at Iowa State University. Before this site became Iowa State University, it was the ancestral lands and territory of the Bakojay or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained the land from the Meskwaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as the 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. This is part 2 of the 3-part visioning process. This module focuses on identifying and overcoming barriers. Here, the red arrow illustrates where we are in the process. We call to mind and capitalize on the ideas and skills that were addressed in the first 3 modules: experiencing change, empowering teams, and facilitative leadership. In the last session, you worked as individuals to brainstorm the vision for your department or program 5 years into the future. And in small groups, you developed those ideas further, and the large group identified common ideas and prioritized vision statements for our work here today. In this session, the group will describe the barriers to those vision statements, and this, in turn, will inform the action plan. The objectives for this session are shown here. Remember, we started with the end. Where do we want to be 5 years from now? Or where do you want to be 5 years from now? Today, we're going to discuss that future state. Go back and revisit what are the high priority vision statements this group agreed to focus on today. Then, you'll identify the barriers that appear to stand in your way. Again, these are the barriers that will present themselves over the next 5 years. We'll identify who owns the barriers or who has the power to remove them. This sets the stage for the action plan, working together to remove the barriers. Part 1 of the visioning process was to describe the future state. Part 2 is identification of barriers. And a barrier is anything or anyone that can derail your efforts to achieve your common goals. Common barriers include lack of information, lack of resources, lack of agreement, or the need to find key partners. The process for identifying barriers will be very similar to how you described your departmental vision for the future. You'll be working in small groups. In those groups, you'll each take some time to brainstorm independently, putting all of the ideas on the table. Then you will combine, coalesce, and build upon those ideas in the group. The facilitator and the recorder will ensure that everyone has an opportunity for input and that all voices are heard, while also assuring that the group doesn't get too bogged down in the past or in the present. After all, we're looking 5 years into the future. Recall that beginning in the future is purposeful. We're anchoring these discussions 5 years in the future. This keeps us from getting bogged down in the present or in the recent past. It also helps the group to establish ownership of the desired future. Recall that we have anchored those departmental vision statements 5 years into the future, and that's important and intentional. Don't want to get bogged down in the present or in the recent past. Do want to establish ownership of the desired future and to take this opportunity to do strategic planning. The objectives for this session are shown here. For the department's high priority goals, participants will, in small groups, identify and prioritize apparent barriers that stand in the way of achieving your vision, and then identify who owns or controls the barriers. discussions about barriers can be more difficult. So facilitative leaderships tend to be instrumental to keeping everyone engaged and maintaining the Objectives for this session are shown here. For the department's high priority goals, you will identify and prioritize the key barriers that stand in the way. You will also identify who owns or controls the barriers. Discussions about barriers can be more difficult, so facilitative leadership skills will be instrumental to keeping everyone engaged and maintaining a focus on the planning. For each barrier that the group identifies, you'll ask who owns the barrier. In other words, who has the power to remove them. As noted here, it's not unusual for departments to determine that they own about 80% of the barriers. Many barriers will have multiple owners. This step is important because it will inform decisions about action planning when we get to the final stage of developing an action plan. So let's get started. We're going to use the same basic process as we did with the visioning step. We're going to form groups that each focus on a visioning statement. Once in the small groups, first thing you want to do is nominate a facilitator and a recorder. In small groups, you will work independently to brainstorm barriers and owners for the vision statement you have selected, keeping in mind that the goal is 5 years into the future. If the group is meeting in person, then participants will record their ideas on sticky notes. If the gathering is virtual, then it may be helpful for each person to type their entries into a doc. Once everyone is done brainstorming, then the facilitator will lead a discussion in which all ideas are shared, with clarifying questions as needed. The recorder will paraphrase and record the ideas, sometimes asking if it would be appropriate to combine or reword barriers from multiple participants. After the small groups have had a chance to identify major barriers, we'll reconvene the large group. Each of the small groups will share their major findings. After they present, we'll provide time for clarifying questions. We'll also keep an eye on the clock to assure that we leave sufficient time for action planning. We anticipate that some major barriers may be present from multiple vision statements. The poster session serves a couple purposes. First, the groups have identified several barriers to the 5-year vision, and it's important to record those insights. Second, in the interest of time, the department needs to prioritize some of the barriers for action planning in the final workshop session. There just simply isn't enough time to do all of them in this day. The posters can be on large sticky notes, or they can be on a virtual platform. Once every participant has had a chance to review the posters, then participants will vote on the barriers to focus on for action planning. For example, each participant might get 3 votes. The barriers that receive the largest totals could then be used for action planning in the next session.